Hi, I'm Adam and welcome to, once again to South Wales Ghost Watch. We've had a bit of time off, so welcome back after New Year. We all hope you all enjoyed. My name's Adam and I've got Martin on the show again with me. Well, it's been a while, Martin.
It's weeks, is it? It's certainly has.
Welcome back, here we are again.
Well, 2013 and the world hasn't ended.
You got a good New Year?
I certainly did.
Oh, fantastic, I did as well. Right, okay, and today we're going to be talking about children in the paranormal, okay? Now the first question, Martin, is are children more likely to see paranormal activity than others, or than adults?
Well, children are more likely to observe activity and interpretation of how people are, more than adults anyway. Children are still learning to observe, to analyse, to understand what's going on. They're more likely to spot tensions between their parents. They're more likely to be aware of hidden language, communication. And so very simply, a child who is not told how to think, see, hear, or whatever, is therefore more likely to be able to perceive in different ways. So if you start with the assumption that children are learning about the world, they are more likely to be able to sense things. So that has consequently a further step in terms of the paranormal. I can remember there's lots of accounts of children up to the age of 3 or 4 being able to talk about when they lived before. And if you actually analyse what they say, they have some very interesting experiences. Probably quite a few people watching will actually know of a small child or remember themselves thinking about their family they had before they were here. So I think as long as you encourage a child to say what they see, perceive, understand, you're going to find all sorts of sixth senses that we don't normally notice. So children who are brought up in a particular way to say, don't be silly, it's your imagination, the dreams aren't real, you don't have to worry about this, are more likely to be children who don't notice things. The key to understanding children's perceptions is to encourage that imagination, to enable them to read, to observe. And so children who are, if you like, open, are more likely to have paranormal experiences. They may not even be aware of the word paranormal. They may just see it as the person I see, the person who I talk to, the person who I chat to at night, doing their parents' heads in at the time. But children are more likely to have paranormal experiences because they're more open and more observant. A parent, a grandparent who's passed on will still be with them in a sense because they're there in their heads. So children should be encouraged, children should be listened to, and the very worst thing you can do is the argument that children should be seen and not heard. Often our interest in the paranormal begin in our childhood. My father used to read myths to me. He was interested in the unknown, and starting out from an open way of looking at things will lead to more paranormal experiences.
Okay.
And children who are emotionally aware will also have.
And what you were saying as well is the children whose parents tell them that it's all rubbish are less likely to see paranormal.
I mean, the point is, if you tell people it's nonsense, it doesn't count, it's your imagination, it's only a dream, are not likely to actually talk about what they actually see.
Okay.
If you continually tell them they're being silly and they should grow up, then they're going to lose connections with what they see and not see it anymore. Often most of the things we don't notice are because they've been educated out of us or told they're not important.
Okay. So tell me about psychic children. Do they have more empathy than others or clairsentience than others?
Yes, they do.
Yeah.
Once more, we see things in terms of conventional 5 senses, but we lose the ability to think intuitively and to feel. So children who are able to, if you like, what do they call it, synesthesia, bring together all the senses, are going to notice other connections.
Okay.
So they're going to be open to that. I think if you should actually listen to what children say, you'll get an awful lot of insight. There's lots of accounts in certain cultures, like the Druze, like in India, where the cultural ideas are that we did live before. So that if you encourage people to explain, they are going to children are going to explain it in what they see, what they understand. It's just a question of listening and seeing and hearing what they say. Children are still making sense of the world, and conventional psychology tends to say that we develop from an imaginary view of the world to a symbolic view of the world, where we learn what to see. When we're born, we have to learn to see and hear. Now, there is memory that exists before we learn to talk. There is memory that we can access, but it's different. To explain what we experience, we have to have the ability to trust what we see, that it's not silly, that it's not going to an indication of psychological illness or whatever. And also, children have an open view on death. They have a view on understanding that things change. So we should encourage that. Psychic children are usually children who are imaginative, dream vividly, like to read or like to hear stories, are fascinated by programs about, well, I can remember my son liking Scooby-Doo as a little boy, and developing interest in those unknown things. It doesn't really matter, it's just listening to what they have to say. And that's why children are prone to be more psychic and more aware. You ask a child what the world is like, and you will find some fascinating observations that you and I have stopped noticing. It takes us a long time to re-educate ourselves, to be open and to understand.
Okay. Are there any bad side effects for children who possess a sixth sense?
If a child grows up in a family that is dysfunctional, that has problems about how the parents' relationship is, have had terrible things happen to them, they are going to learn to escape into a fantasy world to cope with it. So you have to be very careful how you deal with those things. The bad side effects to children, a parent, by being overprotective, by filling the child with fear, can leave things that will appear 30, 40 years later. It's the parents that damage the child, not the child who is largely dysfunctional. If the child sees violence, if the child experiences severe anger, is shouted at, they're going to have all sorts of problems. And the only dangerous fact is where an interest in the paranormal is a means of coping with the unreality of living in an abusive and psychologically damaging family. That's obvious. That's going to set patterns up that's going to run all their lives. So the important thing is to be non-judgmental with what the children say, to listen to them, but not to suppress them. It's very interesting that the most imaginative children are usually children who are left to develop and learn themselves, understanding the basic reading and writing, but really being left to get on with the world. And then they see what the world is. There is the old story that when Columbus and the ships landed in the West Indies, A lot of the natives did not see the ships that landed because they were not used to perceiving them. We have to learn, we get the ability to see things educated out of ourselves. We all remember the story of the Emperor's New Clothes, in which the Emperor was told that he was wearing fantastic clothes but he was stark naked. Somebody had convinced him that he was given a brilliant set of clothes, and the only person who could really see the fact that the Emperor was naked was a small child who actually saw what was there. Sometimes the Emperor's New Clothes are this rationality that gets in the way. So if you encourage children to say what they see, to not hide from them so that they blame themselves for the problems they will begin to understand. And therefore, the only danger is not being straight and being honest and denying that things are going on that are really going on. You ask a child at school about teachers and what they really think, and you ask young children about what they've noticed, they'll really surprise you. The danger, as I said, is when you use these things as a means purely to escape.
Okay. Do you think it's always guaranteed that a parent will pass this psychic ability to their children?
Well, there's two positions here. There's a position that it passed on to the seventh son and things like this, and that psychic stuff is passed down a bloodline. It might simply be that it's not that at all. It might simply be that somebody in that family has actually encouraged them to follow an interest.
So it's a skill more than a gift?
It's a skill more than a gift. When I was 8, I discovered a lot of books that my great-great-aunt had about mystery, magic, psychic phenomena. And it was a thing in the family that was not talked about. So when I told my grandmother I'd read the books, they immediately disappeared. But the damage was done. If you can encourage a child to be open-minded, they will learn what to do. There are people who have natural abilities to be sentient, to understand what's going on. But those people are people who have a gift, like Ian behind there has a gift with computers. People who learn to use tools in any way will develop gifts in themselves. What fascinates me is how quickly young people, my son in particular, can text. It's almost as if something else is going on. He just, so it's part ability to perceive and understand. It's also ability to, if you like, believe, and to think that every view that somebody has is valid. So that's really the position.
So it's about listening and learning.
It's about listening
and learning.
Okay. Just because you're told it's not there doesn't mean it's not there. Just because if you read a book and it stimulates your imagination, you can see things in new ways. The most talented people are sometimes people who have talents that are naturally there, but an awful lot can be learned.
Okay. So tell me about films that deal with psychic abilities, films like The Sixth Sense, The Dead Zone, and stuff like that, things like that.
Well, if you think, let's start with The Dead Zone. The book's by Stephen King, and I seem to think that in that, the guy falls into a coma.
Yes.
And after the coma, he can touch somebody and know what's going to happen to them. By knowing what's going to happen to people, he then has awful responsibilities.
Yes.
Children can just look at you and know what you like. In Sixth Sense, the little boy doesn't even know. I seem to remember that Bruce Willis is dead, but doesn't realise
he's dead.
He's dead. And the little boy, is he dead as well? I can't remember.
No, the boy's alive.
The boy's alive. But you see, the boy can see.
Yes.
But Bruce Willis is not aware that he is dead.
It makes the audience, or makes the audience think that he's actually alive.
All the way through until the particular section of the film.
Yes, that's right, yeah.
So to children, the idea that just because somebody has passed over doesn't mean that they're not there anymore. They're still there. It may be that children do not perceive time in the way that we do, that they're aware of emotional outlooks, perceptions and whatever. Sometimes I can go into a room and just sense what has gone there before. But it's taken me close on 50 odd years to be able to get back to a situation where I can read that. I probably had that naturally as a 4-year-old. I used to ask questions naturally. I used to watch Doctor Who. Often we're told, I mean, if you think of the magic of Harry Potter, yeah,
yes,
learning about those abilities to feel, you've got that whole ability to understand that people are good and that some people are bad, and that they don't mean, that some people don't mean good things to happen to you. They mean nasty things to happen to you. And sometimes as adults we get very unpleasant experiences when we think somebody who was a really good friend is in fact a complete horrible being to us. So if we encourage the children in those films to encourage that imagination, any sort of study of children will be useful. Now, if you think of other examples of children who have strange psychic gifts, you've got films like The Omen.
Yes.
I remember seeing The Omen initially, and there a child who is supposed to be absolutely innocent is the son of the devil. And there is something more horrific to people than a child who is evil. There is a horror story that I have never really ever shaken off. I think it was written by Ray Bradbury, I think. I read it when I was about 12, and it's about a baby who gets out of the cot at night and murders his parents, crawling around with a bloody
That
knife.
sounds very bizarre.
The horror of this story is still with me, because there's a child completely dependent and unable to move, and in this, at night, it comes out, and it's something entirely alien.
I suppose if you watch films like that when you're a child as well, it affects you more, doesn't it? Yeah.
I remember watching Doctor Who when I was about 4 or 5, and it terrified me. The Cybermen. And there was one story about a phantom piper who came and called you away to death. Bloody hell, that frightened me. Yeah. And I had nightmares about it. I was an imaginative child. Gandhi, the great Indian statesman, had full of horrible nightmares as a child. He was full of things like that. And it may simply be that if we have that imagination, we have great abilities and great risks. So the study of children in films is something that we all take for granted, that children are innocent and able to see what the world is really like. But if they're not, that disturbs us because it's something that is so outside our experience. That's why we're horrified about that shooting. There was the Dunblane shooting,
Yes.
and there was the shooting in America recently. And films about horrible things happening to children touch us all, because all of us have the child within that is vulnerable and still scared. So films that deal with evil children, children with extra powers, children with different ways of looking at the world, it's a bit disturbing, but it's also a great challenge. It gets in the way of our assumptions about life.
And children are very sensitive as well.
Children are very sensitive.
They're more sensitive than adults.
And I think
it stays with them longer.
It stays with them
the
longer.
Experience stays with them longer.
The experiences, I mean, some children have memories from a very early age. I can remember memories going back to 2. Not everybody can. That's why we have such a horror of child sexual abuse, because it's demanding, it destroys, if you like, the concept of the world for that child. Ever. They never trust anybody.
Yes.
It's difficult to get back that sense of trust. So films that deal with children touch us emotionally, A, because of the child within ourselves and our own experiences of fear and concern, and B, because the assumption that children are innocent and need to be protected. The terrible, if you think of all those films where children are murdered and whatever, it's usually the stranger from outside. But the unpalatable view really is that children are more likely to be abused or murdered in their family of origin than they are by the stranger outside. And that's why anything about children, anything about understanding different ways of looking at the world, of an evil child, are so difficult for us to deal with.
Yeah, it's a sad case of affairs, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, so what's extrasensory perception?
Extrasensory perception is a way of knowing something has happened that we can't rationally explain. This morning I was doing a session with somebody, and all of a sudden in the room something fundamentally changed. Now, I don't know what that was. I couldn't tell you that I saw anything, heard anything, smelt anything, or anything like that. But all of a sudden, emotionally, things changed.
Okay.
So an ESP is when, if you like, we're using all our senses, but there is something else going on. There are other things happening.
Okay.
So ESP is like using a different sense. If you think about it, we've got all these five senses, but when we put them together, we sometimes get another insight that I can't rationally tell you about.
Okay.
But it's there.
So you can see a small part of the future then?
Yeah, so that was sense.
Right, okay. Oh, that's interesting. Okay. So is it true that if a person suffers an extreme psychological trauma, that they can develop a sixth sense?
Yes.
Yeah? In all circumstances, or just a very few?
Quite a few people who have a near-death experience begin to see the world in a different sort of way afterwards. When we're threatened with death or with a trauma, or we've had a car crash, or we are attacked, just as the traumatic event occurs, time slows down, and what happens is we sort of leave our body. Our brain thinks, oh God, something horrible is about to happen. So time slows down and we sort of dissociate. We float away from the traumatic experience. As we float away from the traumatic experience, we learn to survive. I remember vividly working with a woman who, as a child, had been sexually abused, and she used to escape into a piece of wallpaper, literally, her mind, which was above on the ceiling. And she could draw that wallpaper precisely.
Right.
Yeah? So when we're traumatized, time slows down and we come out the other side. Now, a trauma changes the way we see things forever after that. If we see things, if we realise we survive, we learn that the world is not as it was before the trauma, that the world is different after the trauma. So we understand things in a different sort of way.
Okay.
Children will tell you that once the trauma has gone, they have a memory of bad things. Or if they have I can't remember the car crash that I was in with my parents as a 4-year-old. I remember seeing the car being driven away. I remember playing with a wooden lorry and wooden milk bottles. in the accident and emergency unit, but I cannot for the life of me remember the accident. Apparently I had a very bad nosebleed. Yeah?
Okay, yeah.
I can see my father's car being taken away to be repaired, but I don't remember the actual event. Now, when a trauma occurs, reality is fragmented and a new attitude is developed. If a new attitude is developed, you get different ways of coping with the world after that. That may lead to different ways of looking at the world, having different sixth senses, understanding what might happen, how things are, what will be. A sixth sense of, this happened, now I can see that.
Okay.
Yeah?
Yeah. So it gives you a psychic ability as such.
It gives you a different ability to perceive, which may or may not be a psychic ability.
Just a different perception of life.
A different perception of life, which in many cases will lead to an interest in the psychic and the parapsychological.
Okay, that's interesting. Okay, so what's an indigo or crystal child?
Well, there's a number of ways of looking at that. There is this idea that at the end of the 20th century, the dawning of the age of Aquarius, a lot of children who will see the world in a different way will be born. In Tibet, a lot of Tibetan monks who were killed when the Chinese invaded died and were allegedly reborn in the West. They had years and years of spiritual training as monks, and there was the tradition that when they are reborn, they will have a different way of looking and understanding, that there will be an ability that they have that is an older wisdom that they possessed. The present Dalai Lama, for example, who is I think 75, 76, recognised his spectacles and his false teeth from his previous incarnation, and had memories of that lifetime. So the indigo or crystal child is a child that is believed to have special gifts from past lives. People like Mozart, who at the age of 3 or 4 could hear a piece of music once and remember it perfectly, it could be argued he had a memory from past lives of musical ability.
Okay.
Yeah. Sometimes children will know things that they can't possibly know. And there is this belief that the world is getting more complex, that these children are needed more now, and that as we move to the age of Aquarius, where other perceptions occur, that those children are part of that on-moving approach towards this new way of looking at the world.
Okay, so it plays with the idea of having past lives.
Yes,
interesting.
very
Okay.
much so.
So what age groups are most likely to experience the paranormal, do you think?
That depends. The most interesting conversations about existing before usually are 3 and 4 year olds.
Okay.
There is a idea that they are still learning to perceive. If you remember, it takes to a child who's about 2 for the top of the head to firmly knit into the skull.
Yeah.
And there is the idea that because the child is born before it happens, that their child is part in one world and in another. And that with the closing of the head,
yes,
which to an Eastern mind is a closing of the chakra that leads to perceiving spiritual energy and whatever, that until that happens, they are still both in each world. That part of them still perceives.
Okay, that's interesting.
And many of us might spend many years learning to meditate so we can get back to what we had so easily. There is a tradition that until the 22nd week, 23rd week of conception, the soul and the body are floating around, that the soul is still outside. And that it's the quickening when the baby begins to kick that shows that the soul has entered the body. That's an old Catholic doctrine about it's called the quickening.
Okay.
And that's something that, I'd love to know what children see when they look around. Little babies look around, they're trying to work it out.
Makes you think, do they see our world or do they see a different world?
Well, precisely.
Yeah, it's
We learn to see the world.
a lot to think about, isn't it?
It sure is.
Well, thanks very much, Martin, for coming on the show.
Okay.
It's always been fascinating talking to you, and as always. And thanks very much for those of you who've been watching. We hope you all enjoyed the show. Tune in next week, Thursday, 7 o'clock, usual time. And thanks very much. Take care.
Good night.
Good night. Bye.